As we head into the sixth round of NAFTA negotiations, I can remember you telling us about a sleeper issue, which is the labor mobility, I guess the visas that have allowed Canadians to work south of the border. Can you go through the types of visas? What are they?
Sure. So what NAFTA created was a class of visas called a TN visa in the United States, a Trade North American, they call it. And that's a visa that allows certain classes of enumerated professionals, and there's 63 such groups of professionals enumerated in the NAFTA agreement, to basically cross the border without having basically to have a labor market certification. Essentially, you just need proof that you have the degree that's required, if there is a degree that's required, plus proof that you have a job offer, and then Bob's your uncle, you cross the border, sort of thing. And so that's the easiest class of visa under NAFTA. We have it, it works the same way. Americans come up here, and Mexicans as well, and we can go down there. Canadians can go down there. So that's the one that is under NAFTA. So obviously if NAFTA failed or were canceled, then those TN visas would be at risk.
And TD visas are?
TC visas are, TD visa. TD visas are something else. That's basically if a spouse or a dependent of a person who's on a TN visa gets what's called a TD visa. Now, that's not such a great visa to have because you can't work in the United States under that visa. So basically, the TN visa gives the status to the Canadian, the professional, to cross the border and work, but the spouse is much more limited in terms of what they can do in the U.S.
And this H-1B is?
So the H-1B visa is sort of the classic visa, sort of non-immigrant visa for essentially professionals who want to cross the border. It applies to everyone. Basically, it's capped at a certain number every year, and the main people who benefit from it are essentially people from China and India, and that's been the main visa class that Trump at least said he wanted to target when he came out with his Buy American and Hire American program.
With the possible, I guess, upending of this labor mobility, this free movement that Canadians have with the U.S., how does that impact, I guess, our economy and their economy?
Look, the biggest problem I think right now for us with the Trump administration is uncertainty. And in a sense, he doesn't actually have to terminate NAFTA to begin having effects on our economy. So far, because we're so dependent on the United States, and the United States is upwards of 3% growth now, and Ontario specifically sells a lot into the American supply chain, we're not suffering. We're benefiting from that growth rate. But companies that are making new investments and trying to decide whether to locate, whether to hire people, or what kind of visa status to hire people under, they have to be aware of these changes. And that uncertainty is going to be very hard on us. It's going to be very hard on American businesses who want to acquire and attract Canadian talent. So, but in terms of Donald Trump's ability to affect the Canadian economy, in some sense, termination might be his dream, but uncertainty that continues and makes people make investments across the border gets him half of what he wants.
Now, ultimately, as you've just mentioned, this is part of a bigger equation, which is immigration. But I'd like to know, how are they tightening up on these? How are they tightening up on these visas? I mean, we've all heard Trump's immigration policy.
Well, the most recent one that applies to Canadians is a TN visa. Now, what I would say is, for the longest while, the most general classification under TN visa was the management consultant. And the reason for that is you didn't have to have a specific degree. You didn't have to have a bachelor's in commerce. You didn't really have to have any work experience. And so a lot of Canadians would essentially go down there and work as real estate agents or work in the financial industry as management consultants when they weren't managing much or consulting on anything. So more recently, in November of this year, the Trump administration signaled that they're going to tighten up on the definition of economist, which seems sort of strange. But I think what's happened, this is my guess, is that over time, as people had a harder time crossing the border as management consultants, people were coming across more often as economists. Again, because it was just a general category that said you had to have an undergraduate degree, didn't specify that you had to have an economics degree, didn't specify that you had to have any work experience, and so you ended up as a lot of people working on Wall Street as traders, as whatever, in the financial industry, who were coming in under TN visas as economists, but who weren't doing economics. And so what the Trump administration is saying, that's not quite what we agreed to. You should apply for an H-1 visa. And that's essentially what they're doing. They've tightened up the definitions. They haven't ended it. They're just sort of saying, show to us that you're actually working as an economist, and they've defined what economists do. And they've said, if you're going to cross under that visa, you have to be working as an economist. So that's a signal of where they're going.
But if we're still hearing this buy American, hire American, ultimately, how successful will we be in continuing this kind of, labor mobility between the two countries if ultimately the language that's coming out of there is, let's protect our American workers?
Well, I mean, I think it's a fair point. I mean, Canada entered the negotiations with great hopes of expanding the TN visa to new classes in the digital economy, and that was the hope. Because the digital economy didn't exist in 1994, essentially, and the idea was that we would specify more clearly certain classes of workers who are graphic artists of a certain kind and call them professionals. Now, I would say that this is probably an issue that will be dealt with and finalized at the end of the negotiation, in the sense that if Trump gets what he wants somewhere else in the agreement, big ticket items that so far we've been resisting and calling poison pills, things like reforms to Chapter 19, dispute settlement, trade remedy review, maybe some changes to supply management, maybe he'll take another look at the TN visa class. But where we're falling into is, even if they don't have a great problem with the TN visa, we're falling into his other commitments on immigration, and that's going to be more, make it harder for him to make a concession. Perhaps it's not just the Americans. When we negotiated with the Europeans.
I was going to ask,
Sure.
is there opportunity, I guess, for Canada, good opportunity then to go across the pond?
There is an opportunity, but to be very honest, the Europeans did not give us the gold-plated agreement that the Americans gave us. The TN visa is renewable, is granted for periods up to 3 years, and is basically infinitely renewable. The Europeans were only prepared to go to a 12-month visa, which could be renewed under special circumstances, and after the 12 months, they said that the CETA commitments wouldn't apply. So it's just not what we have from the Americans, and it may be an indication that other trading partners, and the Americans will probably look at that. They will be aware of what Canada gave in Europe, and the Americans may want to say in the NAFTA context, well, why are we giving 3 years for you when you only agreed to one with the Europeans? So all these points are going to be points of negotiation, but the fact that we've got the 12-month visa with Europe, look, if we lose NAFTA altogether, a lot of Canadians can cross the border, hopefully, and cross the pond, not so much the border, and start working over there. But it won't be the great stories we've heard of Canadians living for a long time. These are large numbers too, right? I mean, I think the Americans calculated a certain way, but I think last year they said in 2016 there were some 66,000 individual TN visa holders who crossed an average of 12 times. You add to that the TDs, so their dependents and whatever.
Relatives.
So you start talking about numbers that are probably upwards of 100,000. If you think that these are 3-year visas, not every Canadian who's on a TN visa is crossing the border to come home and see family. So you're probably easily looking at a number that approaches 100,000 and more.